back. This is ThinkTech. This is movies you can learn from, and this is the movie today. You can really learn from this one, The Defection of Simas Kudirka in 1970 off Martha's Vineyard during fishery talks between the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant and the Sovietskaya Litva, which said it was a trawler, but it wasn't a trawler, it was a factory ship. This movie was made in 1978 with Alan Arkin and a few other, really good actors. And it was an attempt to recreate, attempt to be a documentary, but they changed some of the names and they changed some of the events too for dramatic, quote, dramatic effect. Later on in 2020, a Polish filmmaker made another movie, more of a documentary, more of documentary clips. And this was called Jump, referring to Simas Kudirka's jump from the guardrail at the Sovietskaya Litva onto the deck of the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. It was a very, very famous event. It brought the whole Nixon government into play. Books were written, and now, of course, at least 2 movies were made. And it's part of the history of the relationship between Russia and Lithuania, and between Russia and the United States, and between the State Department and the Coast Guard and the White House. A lot of people were not alive so long ago, but let me tell you, this was headline news for weeks and weeks and weeks. And he got back here, which is the most miraculous part of it. I know a lot about this because I was the counsel for the Board of Investigation in the Coast Guard that looked into it. And I want to add one other thing before I stop, and that is that that there was an article in the Times talking about this Polish movie, and I tried to contact Simas Kudirka, who was then living, although I didn't realize it, in Lithuania. He had gone back. This was in 2020 or so, and I tried as hard as I could to contact him because I wanted to have the circle come full turn. I had known him, by virtue of my investigation for the Coast Guard, but I had never met him, and I wanted to say hi. Unfortunately, he wasn't interested in any media, and so I never did say hi. And now, 2 years later, on February 14th, Simas Kurdirka died. And so you have all these vectors coming together. The trouble in Russia, the trouble with the former satellites, in Lithuania being one of them. The trouble between the Russian diplomats and the U.S. And the state of the military and how it conducts itself in cases of attempted defection. This is a very timely movie, even though it was made in 1978. Right after this, I'm going to be asking George Casen what he thinks. Yeah, welcome to the show, George. Nice to have you. And I want to thank you for watching that movie. It's a very good movie. It's very watchable. I watched it myself, and I couldn't put it down. And I know the story. I know the true story, not the Hollywood story, but I liked it very much. Why don't you, give us the broad outlines of what happened?
This is the story of, as you said, of Simas Kudirka, a Lithuanian gentleman who was on a ship, and I think you said it was a fishing vessel. Fishing vessel,
claiming to be a trawler, but it wasn't a trawler. It was a factory ship, and that apparently had some relevance in the fisheries discussions. Yes. Between the Russians who controlled that ship, yeah. and the Coast Guard.
Yeah, there was a series of fishing discussions that were going on between Russia and the United States at this time.
Yeah, right off Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, it was right, and that's where they were meeting on a Coast Guard ship to discuss these fishing issues with the Russians. Right before Simas Kudirka got back on this ship, he had been on the water on a ship for 20 years. And his supervisor had advised him that they were going to transfer him to shore duty, which he was really happy about because he wanted to be with his wife and daughters more time, because he was away so many years for so much time, right? So it seems that somehow that order from his supervisor never got through. And when he went to finalize the orders, the guy in the office was telling him there were no such orders, and you're also 5 days overdue to be on a boat, to be on your which was your next gig, right? So he's upset, right? Because his supervisor actually told him this. So eventually,
there's a point there that you should mention, and that is he had been involved in an investigation. I think it was of his relative years before.
Yes.
Brother, right? And the KGB wanted him to turn the brother over to identify him, so the brother could go to jail for a long time, and he refused to do that, and that made him, an enemy of the state. So he had a bad track record. He was carrying that baggage around, as far as the communists were concerned, all of his life. So there is probable, in truth and in the movie, that they didn't want to let him have shore duty. They didn't want to give him any favors. They wanted to put him back on a ship for another period of decades, because he carried around the baggage of not informing on his brother.
Exactly, precisely. Yeah. Thank you, Jay, for adding that. So basically, he agrees to go back on the ship, right? And while they're on the ship, right, the boats are going to be meeting the Coast Guard vessel for this meeting, for this fisheries meeting. So they see all the American Coast Guard guys, on the boat, and they're communicating back and forth, the Russian crew and the Coast Guard crew, and the Coast Guard crew is throwing American magazines, with American culture, up onto the balcony. I mean, onto the boat, onto the Russian fishing trawler, right? So there are all these magazines. So can
I just add, if you don't mind?
Sure.
The Coast Guard crew is being very friendly.
Yes.
And the Soviet sailors are being very friendly to the Coast Guard, and they're exchanging icons, like their clothing, cigarettes,
right.
Anything and everything that would be of interest to the other side, because these ships were tied up only a few feet away from each other, riding together in the ocean. So they had the chance to throw things, and it wasn't a far throw. And both sides, both the men on the Sovietskaya and women on the Sovietskaya Litva, and on the Vigilant, were really having a good time. They were very friendly. And what was remarkable for Simas was that he was what they call the captain of the head. They designated him as a radio operator, but in fact, he was cleaning the toilets. And he was really ticked off, because this was another element of his failure to identify, to tell on his brother from years past. They put him at the lowest possible job in the Sovietskaya Litva. So he was really unhappy, and he kept thinking how wonderful it was to be an American, to be in America, to have freedom. Because at the time, the people in Lithuania, let's see a map of Lithuania. At the time, the people in Lithuania were subjugated to the Russians. This is at a time where Russia controlled all of, it was the Soviet Empire, and it controlled all of these satellite countries, Lithuania being one of them, and they made the Lithuanian people subject to their KGB kind of tactics, and it was bloody awful. He couldn't stand it. He wanted freedom. He saw the U.S. as freedom, and so when he saw those guys having such a good time, it occurred to him that he really wanted to be there in the U.S. Sorry, go ahead.
No, there's one other factor. His grandfather had been in America, had gone to America, and his mother was born in America, and then they went back to Lithuania. So he had a tie, and his grandfather would tell him about how Americans are free. That was just an aside. Now, what happened is Kudirka's close friend took some of those magazines and stuck it in his coat, right? And this KGB operative who was on the boat, right? He sees this friend with the coat is sort of puffed up. So he says, open your coat, open your coat. So the guy doesn't want to open his coat, but when he opens his coat, all the American, magazines fall to the floor. And then they're going to do dirty on this close friend. So I think that's pretty much what pushed Kudirka over the edge, because
in the movie anyway, for sure. Yeah.
He knew this was going to be bad for him. So basically, he starts thinking, back and forth, that he wants to get out. He's forgot his wife and his daughters, at that point, and in a move that was very much not. I mean, suddenly he decides he's gonna jump. So when the two boats are close together, right? He gets up and he jumps this 8 feet or whatever, barely makes it on the Coast Guard vessel. And then it becomes an international incident. And the Russians want him back, right? Because it's all on the news. He's defected. He's asking for defection, right?
Sanctuary,
Yeah, he wants a sanctuary in the United States. And initially, he doesn't even think of his wife and daughter, but then later he asks for them to come too. So bottom line is the American line of command, the captain played by Richard Jordan, who unfortunately died very young, but the actor died. He had to talk to his superiors, So he contacts a few people, under code. It's coded, right? It's coded messages. And the first level, he tells, I got to contact a guy even higher up. So the guy higher up that's in his pajamas, he's got the flu, he's in Washington somewhere. He says, we can this fishing agreement is much more important than some Lithuanian sailor. This is not important. So, send them back, but play it diplomatically, have them go into the water, and then don't make any effort to pick them up and let the Russians pick them up. So it's sort of a complicated kind of thing, right? But eventually, what the captain, played by Richard Jordan, decides from what he's been told, he lets the Russians come onto his Coast Guard vessel and forcibly take Kudirka back to the Russian vessel, right?
There was a huge fishing Lithuanian community in New England who made a great stink politically about what happened. And they kept on pounding on the White House for years. And we'll talk about that later, about their success. What I'm telling you is that the names of the principals, I find this interesting. The movie was made in 1978. The names of the principals were changed. The admiral was a 2-star admiral. His name was William Ellis. That's his real name. And the movie is fairly accurate, by my recollection, about what happened, what he said, what he did, what he ordered. Okay? And he was sick. He had some kind of minor operation, and he was sick at home. The chief of staff, who was the second in command at the district office, was a guy named Brown, the captain.
Exactly. Right.
But that's not the name they used in the movie. And the captain of the ship was a fellow named Ralph Eustace, and they didn't use his name either in the movie. But I think in great part, what happened, this part that you just described is an accurate statement. In other words, you're accurately stating the movie is accurately stating what happened in terms of the moves they made and how Kudirka, got onto the ship and what happened with the admiral's instructions and orders, and how he got into back on the Sovietskaya Litva. I would add one thing, and I want to show this now. There was a pack of cigarettes, and Kudirka put a message in the pack of cigarettes, and he threw it to the crew members. And this is the message on a little piece of paper in the pack of cigarettes that he threw to the crew. This was in our report. This was actually went to Congress because Congress wanted to try to make this right somehow. Okay, what he was really saying here in broken English is, I'm trying to defect. How about help me out? And that's why, it's sort of a gap in the movie. That's why the captain decided, hey, this guy is serious. This is not a joke. He really wants to defect. And so that's where it got real serious. That's where the whole chain of events started happening. You also mentioned that that they were using some kind of confidential radio transmission. What happened, and I can tell you, is that their radio was broken. I think there was a reference to that in the movie.
Yeah, it was a reference at a certain.
And they had to use regular marine ship to shore for all the world to hear, which was pretty gross. The other gross thing, and I'll comment on it in a minute, was that when he received his instructions to return Simas to the Sovietskaya Litva and make up this phony business about how he goes in the water and the Coast Guard, which is expert at pulling people out of the water, was going to hold back so the Russians, who were also somewhat expert in this, could pull them out first. It's pretty much true, but the part about the crew of the Vigilant, the crew didn't want to participate in any of this because they knew that this order was illegal. This was an illegal order against American policy. You don't give defectors back. We take defectors. If there's a decision to be made about the defector, it's made at the highest level. And that came through in the movie, and the crew knew better than the captain. And that's why they didn't want to participate in physically removing the man from the Coast Guard cutter and handing him over. So Eustace made this incredible decision, and that was his. He said, well, we'll have the Russians come aboard a United States fighting ship and physically use force to remove somebody who didn't want to be removed, who would be violent, physically remove him. And they did. They put him in a blanket and they beat him to a pulp. They banged his head against a steel bulkhead and they removed him. And the crew was just absolutely astounded. And Eustace, the captain, stood by and let this happen. And when you watch the movie, I don't know about your reaction, George. And of course, at the time I was writing this report, it was really, really irritating. Really, you could get so angry by all the sequence of failures. And I can talk about that more, but we don't have time. That led to this horrible scenario where the man put his life on the line to come to the United States, knowing what the Russians would do if he was returned to them. And then the Coast Guard, hearing all of that, turns him back, lets them come and beat him up and take him off the ship. And of course, he went before a trial, and the movie says it was treason. They charged him with treason in Russia. That's him. And put him in jail until 1974, which we can talk about.
Yeah, we can talk about what happened. But I'll do, as an aside, you mentioned that note, but the movie, I don't think ever mentioned that there was a note like that. That was not in the movie.
I'm telling you, there was a note.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, there were a lot of things that the movie didn't catch.
They didn't catch.
And they say that. They say that this movie was changed, the names were changed, and some of the events were changed for, quote, dramatic purposes, end quote.
So 1974, a lot of Lithuanian cultural groups in the United States, New England, start lobbying their congressman, Hanrahan, or whoever, which is a lot of Lithuanians in his congressman's district, to turn this around, right? So there's a guy at the State Department, they're going and meeting with him and complaining. The head of the State Department is one of the big top people at the Department of State, played by McMacken or something, the actor John McMacken. And what happened is eventually they utilized the fact that his mother was born in America, because his grandfather and his mother was born in America, Kudirka's mother, and that Kudirka was born out of wedlock. So they didn't know who his father was. So the mother was the one, and she's an American, born in America. And even though he was born in Lithuania, he's an American, right? Because his mother's an American. So eventually, and the Russians were sort of backing down because they didn't, they didn't want to make a big deal about this one guy. So eventually they free and the scene that really bothered me is when they take Kudirka and they tell him to put on his clothes and they put him in this black limo or whatever, and they're taking him to some site, right? And the driver's got a gun and he's playing with the gun, getting the gun ready to. So he says, am I going to be killed? And the Soviet official next to him says, you're asking a political question. And he says, what do you mean political? And the Soviet official says, assassinations are always political. This guy's scared to death that they're going to kill him, right? But lo and behold, they just did this to screw with his brain, right? Make him crazy. So basically, they drop him off on an abandoned road out in the wilderness, right? And then another car comes from the American embassy and picks him up, and they take him to America. And then they negotiate his wife and his two daughters to come to America too. So it was. This is how the thing ends finally. But diplomatic. I don't really blame the captain because he was just following orders from.
It depends on how you look at it. I wanted to raise that. This is a guy who wakes up one morning commanding a ship with a pretty good record, and he was a commander, 3 stripes and all that. Everything was going well until this happens. Yeah. And George, from the naval culture point of view, you knew that no matter which way this thing went, right, Ralph Eustis's career was in great jeopardy. Exactly. If he decided correctly, and said to the boys on top, I'm not taking that order, the Coast Guard would have had him. Right. If he says, I am taking that order, well, public opinion was against him. This is a tragedy that was visited right on top of the Coast Guard. It never had an issue, a case like this. And I think it lost a lot of credibility in Congress and among the public for turning back a defector. But you knew that Eustis's career was over whichever way he went. So I don't think that he should have been thinking about that. I think he should have been thinking about what's the right thing to do. Forget my career for a minute. What's the right thing to do? And you know what the right thing to do was. We all know what the right thing to do was, not only now, but then. And he should have taken that man away. He had the ability to steam away. They'd cut the lines, as I recall. Yep. And they were steaming away, but he decided to give the man back anyway. What an incredible mistake that was. And his crew was not going to be friendly. They were all going to tell the investigators what they saw, how they felt, and how they felt this was an illegal order. But his punishment was much less severe than the 2 higher. That's another question. I was there when that punishment was determined. And looking at the movie, it struck me that, this is sort of like the Ehemi Maru back in 2001, off Pearl Harbor, where the Greenville killed 16 people on a Japanese fishing vessel. And the captain of the Greenville, also a commander, he'd made all kinds of mistakes, but he got out. He got an early retirement is what he got with I shouldn't say early. He was forced politically to retire, and the punishment was minimal. And that's what happened with William Ellis and the Captain Brown. They really got away cheap, considering the incredible mistake they made in American policy. But the ship captain, they just gave him shore duty. He was no longer on. His career was finished. Well, the 2 higher ups were forced to resign. The knuckleheads. I mean, I couldn't believe how stupid they were, knowing the big picture. And I think who was it that said, even the captain of the vessel, he said, this is something, he was telling his higher ups, this is something that has to be resolved from the diplomatic corps. This is not something we can do at the Coast Guard, but they ignored him and they gave him orders,
you've got to do this, you've got to do this. So he was, as you said, he was in a really tight spot.
Well, the thing is, American policy is very clear on defectors. You have to present it to the higher ups in the State Department. You don't make the decision at sea like that. And he didn't know. He was ignorant about major American policy. When he told his lawyer in that scene in the movie, this is beyond my understanding, beyond my authority. That was pretty weak. He's the captain of the ship. He should have known, and he did not do his due diligence. He did not understand. He did not act in accordance with obvious American policy, and I don't think he did a good job at all.
But Jay, I worked for the government, and I know that you're supposed to follow orders. Coast Guard is sort of
That's the whole issue about Andersonville and the Civil War. It's the whole thing, about all these people who were tried at Nuremberg. I was only following orders. Well, if the order is obviously illegal, don't follow the order. In a democratic society, there's a line. And I'm afraid that Ralph Eustace crossed the line. That's my view. In any event, the other thing you want to mention here is that a person who was born outside the United States of a mother who is born in the United States has no claim to citizenship. So what they did is they introduced a special bill in Congress. It would have been 1971 or 2, when the matter was still fresh in the public perception. And they made him a citizen by virtue of his connection with the mother. This was not in the statute. This was not part of the immigration law, but they thought it was enough of a hook so that they could make a special bill. And that's how he got out of jail, in the Cold War at the time. And somehow they pressured the Russian government to return him and his family and his wife and his parents, all of them, to the U.S., which was really a miracle.
I wonder if his wife, if she's still alive, and his kids, his daughters, are still in the United States. There's a picture you just put up of his.
Yeah, this is the real Simas and the real wife.
Looking guy. And
those are not the actors. Yeah. And that's the real family at the time they were living in the United States.
He might have gone back in his later years just to renew his relationship. But getting back to the whole issue about how does that play into what's going on today with Russia and Lithuania and Ukraine and now Moldavia, which was part of
Moldava,
part of Romania, and right on the border of Ukraine, and then also Caucasus, what's going on there. Putin wants to pull all these former Soviet states and even the Eastern Europe back in under his umbrella, wants to resurrect the Soviet Union. This is what's going. They play so many games. I mean, they're playing. Putin is now threatening nuclear war. They say he's very sick. So if he's terminal, if he's got cancer, and he figures he's got 6-8 months a year to live, he's going to be nuts. He doesn't give a care about anybody else, right? So what is he going to do? Is he really going to go nuclear war? And Stoltenberg and NATO, they're not going to back down. So where are we headed, right? So this and the whole idea of how the KGB operated, how the Soviets operated, and sort of I wonder all these top-notch, top-level Soviet, Russian officials that are jumping out of windows and committing suicide. It's sort of, you start to wonder, what is really going on, right? So very apropos, watching the movie, the KGB, how they operated, how they played the minds of the citizens. How does that play into today? Jay, how do you feel about that?
Oh, I think that the movie is totally relevant, not just because Simas Kudirka died. Yeah. It makes it relevant for me anyway. And this other movie came out, even more accurate documentary, the Polish filmmaker. Right. But let me say that this is totally relevant in view of what happens when the Russian, instrumentalities move into a satellite state. There's no hope for democracy. There's no hope for civil liberties. There's no hope for freedom. And that's what, in 1978, that's what Alan Arkin was saying. I can't stand it here. I can't live here. I'll never have a life here. My family will never have a life here. I will take the jump. I will leave. Again, and you know why this is relevant is that right now, today, if Putin takes over Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and Poland and Belarus, all these places, and moves his instrumentalities, the Russian government style, into those places, there are going to be a lot of Simas Kudirkas. That's what.
That's right.
And it's going to regress back to the was in the Cold War. And that's why this movie is so important right now. Made in 1978, totally relevant now.
You know, even with Georgia, when he invaded, he took those two parts of Georgia and incorporated, just like Donbass and the other Ukrainian things. That's his game. So he took parts of Georgia, and then he's maneuvering in the other places in the Caucasus to take back all of those territories. So, and as you said, they're going to lose all their freedom. That's why the Ukrainians are fighting so hard. They don't want to be under this former KGB operatives, you know, reign, you know, that they want their freedom. So this is very apropos. What do you think of the original 1978 movie? Rate it.
Well, I want to be more comprehensive about it in the sense that where does it fit? You know, is it a movie we can learn from, right?
Yeah.
The title of our show.
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, it's a movie we can learn from. And I would give it a 9. And only, I'm a little reserved about the fact they changed the names and they changed some of the events. And so, you know, the public was getting a Hollywood dramatized story of the reality. But the press was saying this is a relatively accurate representation of the reality. Well, it was in some ways, but not in all ways. I guess it was in the sense that these mistakes were made. And, it was horrible what happened. You know, if you look at it from that point of view, from the national policy and military justice point of view, it was horrible that this happened and that nobody really paid a high price for the apparent destruction. The only salutary fact is that he did get out of prison. He did get back from Siberia to New Jersey or wherever it was. And, so there's a happy ending, although he gave up a lot of his life and, a lot of his happiness because this happened. He thought he was making the big break. And I think Alan Arkin did a good job in portraying the horror, the horrible experience when the Coast Guard, turned him back. That was just horrible. And Eustace said to him in the movie, "I'm sorry." "Not enough, buddy. Not enough that you're sorry. It's bigger than both of us." Sorry, you ruined this guy's life. And it's only lucky that there's relatively speaking, a happy ending. And presumably his family was or is here. And so that's a happy ending for them too. So I give it a 9. I didn't see The Jump movie made in 2020. I don't think it was in English, by the way. I'm not sure. And I would like to see that. It's not easily available, actually. And I'd like to see how accurate that one is.
I didn't see The Jump either. I'm agreeing with you. It's about a 9.5. There was sort of things in the movie that were really not that polished, Alan Arkin played the role good, but knowing how his skill now at his 80s and some of the other things we've seen, he's really even gotten much better. His skills are superb. So a 9 and 9, and let's put, not to have to be exactly the same as you, I'll say a 9.5. There's some negatives on this movie, and I don't have the knowledge of what really happened like you do, but I sort of felt some of the acting was a little fuzzy there. So I'll say, it wasn't as much as I would like. So I'll say a 9.5. I'll give it a 9.5.
One other comment is that when Simas Kudirka died 2 weeks ago, the press in Europe and in Lithuania made a big deal about it. And they called him an activist and various names to suggest that he was doing great service to the state, to the people, and all that. I never learned that from my investigation. I think maybe it was glossed later when he made a big stink to get out of jail, and he yelled at the judge. Remember that scene in the movie? He yelled at the judge, "You call me a traitor, I'm calling you a traitor." He was very unhappy with the Russian, the Russian thing in Lithuania. But what I was interested in is that when he died, there's all this press in Europe, more in Europe than the U.S., although the Times covered it, and that's important. And then we have the new movie, which has not really been all that well promulgated, and that's important that we learn. And then you and I can do this show, and we can talk about what happened in 1970, 71, 70, and in 1978 in the movie. And so it's worth remembering, is what I'm saying. All of this is worth remembering. And bottom line, your term, is that we should not forget him. We should not forget what happened. We should not forget the extraordinary difference in civil liberties and quality of life in a democracy versus what happens in Russia or in any country that Russia takes over, makes into a satellite. The story of Simas Kurdirka is a story that would be repeated many, 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 many times if they took over, the Russians took over Ukraine, and they were trying hard, and these other former satellite countries. It would all play out again, and the movie would happen again. And that is the value of this movie and this review.
Thank you for this. This has opened my eyes as well. Movies I could learn from. I learned from this movie.
Thank you, George. Thank you for sharing and letting me share.
Thank you.
And
Jay.
we'll be back in 2 weeks with more. You will see movies you can learn from.
Exactly.
George Casen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.